Are we living in the late stages of a global empire? I mean, you probably think our modern tech monopolies, right? The algorithm-driven platforms, the massive global supply chains we rely on every single day, you probably think all of that is brand new.
Oh, absolutely. We all do. We have this assumption that we're experiencing a completely unprecedented era of human history.
Right, because we have smartphones and AI, so obviously the mechanics of our global economy must be an invention of the 21st century.
Exactly. We suffer from what you could call chronological snobbery, but, when you actually start pulling on the historical threads, that whole illusion just shatters.
It really does, because the underlying code for world hegemony, the exact playbook for how global monopolies operate, how they extract resources, and crucially, how they justify their dominance, that was all written 200 years ago.
200 years ago, yeah.
And today's global economy might honestly just be repeating a script of late imperial madness. Looking at the source material we have today, the parallels are, well, they'll send chills down your spine.
They really will. So, today we are taking a deep dive into the Victorian British Empire. Specifically, we're looking through the lens of Jan Morris's landmark historical work, Heaven's Command.
Right.
And this covers the era from 1837 to 1897. But what makes this source so compelling, I think, is the vantage point of the author herself.
Yeah, she wasn't just some historian sifting through dusty archives centuries later, right?
Not at all. Born in the 1920s, she served in the military and actually witnessed the final physical collapse of the British Empire firsthand.
She was literally on a troop train in 1947 watching the infrastructure of this global behemoth just being dismantled.
Right, so when she sits down to write about the rise of the empire in the 1800s, she's doing it as an autopsy.
An autopsy, wow, that's the perfect word for it.
She is standing in the ruins of the 20th century, looking backward. This is not a hymn of praise, it's not some traditional textbook celebration of the Victorian era.
No, it's a surgical report on how the world truly operates. And really, what happens to the psychology of a nation when it achieves absolute power.
Exactly. She approaches it almost like a Roman centurion, reflecting on the glory days of the legions, but knowing full well that Rome eventually falls.
Right.
We're going to unpack her analysis of this 60-year period. Not to judge the era by modern standards, but, to understand the raw mechanics. How is power consolidated? How is it justified? And what happens when a society realizes its dominance is slipping?
Well, wait, are you telling me that the modern tech giants and the ruthless corporate PR strategies we see today are essentially just running the Victorian era's operating system, just with better microchips?
I mean, honestly, yes. Reading through these events, the feeling of déjà vu is overwhelming. The structural similarities are undeniable.
Okay, so to understand this code, we have to start by examining the incredible paradox of 1837.
We do. We have to look at how a nation that was tearing itself apart from the inside, a country on the brink of total collapse, somehow transformed into the master of the world.
It's wild. Let's set the scene for you. It's 1837. An 18-year-old Queen Victoria has just taken the throne.
18 years old.
Right. And from the outside, or at least from the perspective of the aristocracy, the empire looks like a fairy tale. Just wealth and elegance.
Oh, completely. You have figures like the Honorable Emily Eden, right? She's the sister of the Governor General of India.
Yeah, and she's floating up the Ganges River in this private flotilla.
A traveling caravan of 12,000 people?
12,000. With elephants, redcoat sentries, and she's just lounging on the deck reading pirated copies of Charles Dickens.
It's absurd, but that image represents the absolute pinnacle of privilege. The elites viewed their world as this enlightened, beautifully ordered society. Miss Eden even referred to the young Queen Victoria as a, quote, charming invention.
Charming invention. Wow. But that glittering surface was floating on an absolute ocean of misery.
It really was.
Because England back home was a powder keg. And the big question is, how does a society in this much internal pain conquer the globe? The statistics are horrifying.
1 in 10 people in the country were classified as paupers.
1 in 10.
Yeah. We're talking about 8- and 9-year-old children working 12-hour shifts in pitch-black, deafening textile mills.
And women, naked women, dragging heavy coal wagons through incredibly narrow, dangerous mine shafts just to survive.
It's brutal. The country was enduring this horrific transition from an agricultural society to an industrial one.
Right.
The social fabric was just being shredded.
And the elites in London were terrified.
Terrified. They're looking across the channel at the legacy of the French Revolution, and they're looking out their own windows at the Chartist movement.
Which was this massive working-class agitation demanding basic political rights.
Exactly, demanding the vote.
Yeah.
They saw the Luddites smashing textile machinery. The Duke of Wellington genuinely believed a bloody revolution was imminent. He feared the aristocracy would be, as he put it, plundered by forms of law.
So the internal pressure is at an absolute boiling point.
Yeah.
But here's the detail that completely upends the traditional narrative of how empires are built.
Yeah.
This extreme internal torture, this horrific exploitation of their own working class that was the exact forge that created their global monopoly.
The suffering was the engine of their supremacy. By burning through their own workforce and aggressively mining their unlimited supplies of coal and iron, Britain achieved a total, unparalleled monopoly on steam technology.
They became the workshop of the world.
Right. While the rest of the globe was still operating on wind, water, animal muscle, Britain was mass-producing the capital goods, the engines, the looms, the railways, the stuff every other nation desperately needed to modernize.
So they are suffering unimaginable social conflict at home. But on the global stage, they are untouchable.
Untouchable. They've defeated Napoleon, the Royal Navy controls the shipping lanes, London is the financial center of the universe.
Yet at this exact moment of peak technological and financial power, in 1837, the British elites didn't actually want an empire.
This is the face-slapping fact, right? They didn't want colonies. The concept of formal colonialism was deeply unpopular among the ruling class.
Why? Just the cost.
The cost, the bureaucracy. They had fresh memories of the disastrous American Revolution. Richard Cobden, a really prominent politician, referred to colonies as gorgeous and ponderous appendages.
Ponderous appendages. I love that.
They required troops, administrators, infrastructure. It all drained the treasury.
So instead of planting flags and building forts, they preached a new gospel. Free trade.
Free trade. The logic was simple. Why take on the massive expense of governing a foreign territory when you can just dominate them economically?
Right. Britain had all the steam engines and all the cheap, mass-produced textiles.
So if they could just convince the world to open its borders and drop all tariffs, British goods would naturally flood the market and wipe out any local competition.
The philosophy of free trade was presented as this peaceful, enlightened exchange. But in practice, it was deployed as a weapon of mass economic destruction.
A total weapon. Because the British possessed the means of production at a scale literally no one else could match. When they poured their manufactured goods into weaker nations, they effectively destroyed local artisans.
Indigenous industries just couldn't compete with the sheer volume and low cost of British steam-powered production.
They couldn't. It's like a ruthless modern startup, right?
Yes. It's exactly like burning your own workforce to the ground just to capture 100% of the market share. And then, once you have the absolute monopoly, you use the philosophy of an open market to crush any smaller competitors who try to build their own local alternatives.
That analogy holds up remarkably well. The massive surplus of capital generated by those horrific factory conditions had to flow outward to survive.
The economy demanded constantly expanding markets. But what happened if a foreign nation realized, hey, our local industries are being annihilated? We need to put up a tariff to protect ourselves.
Did the British rely on the peaceful principles of the free market then?
Let me guess. No.
Absolutely not. The commitment to peaceful trade evaporated the second a market closed its doors. If a weaker nation attempted to protect its economy with tariffs, the Royal Navy gunboats were dispatched.
Just sent right in.
They would blockade ports, bombard coastal cities, and literally force the borders open with artillery fire.
That is profound irony. The politicians who most despised the idea of formal colonies ended up creating an aggressive economic model that required constant military intervention.
Which laid the groundwork for the most expansive empire in human history.
So this relentless pursuit of capital efficiency drove their economic expansion. But it gets even more complicated, right? Because this same cold, calculating drive for efficiency didn't just dictate their trade policies.
No, it secretly drove what the empire considered its greatest moral triumph.
We have to talk about the abolition of slavery.
The 1838 abolition, the traditional historical framing of this is pure, enlightened moral awakening.
Right, the heroes of history realizing the error of their ways.
But Jan Morris's analysis asks us to look closely at the balance sheets of the 1830s, and it reveals a much more complex, calculating reality behind the humanitarianism.
Okay, let's look at how the event was actually celebrated.
Right.
August 1st, 1838, midnight in Falmouth, Jamaica.
A very moving scene.
Incredibly moving. You have the Reverend William Knibb, this fierce abolitionist, standing in his packed Baptist church, sweltering tropical heat. The clock strikes midnight, and he points out over his congregation and shouts, "The monster is dead."
And the newly freed slaves literally take the chains, the iron collars, the whips they had suffered under, and they bury them deep in the dirt.
Complete, absolute freedom for over 760,000 people across the empire. It looks like the ultimate victory for the evangelical movement.
And we really cannot discount the genuine moral fervor of the evangelicals. Men like William Wilberforce and the humanitarians operating out of Exeter Hall in London, they fought for decades because they believed slavery was an abomination before God.
Right, morally, abolition did elevate the British on the world stage. It was a monumental shift.
It was. But we must also ask, why did this crusade finally succeed at this specific moment in 1838 after failing for so long?
Right. Why then?
The answer lies in the shifting mechanics of the global economy. The old British Empire was built entirely on the back of the transatlantic slave trade.
The triangular trade route. Shipping manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and raw sugar and cotton back to Britain.
Exactly. That was the foundation of massive wealth for port cities like Bristol and Liverpool. But by the late 1830s, the economic equation had fundamentally changed.
The plantation system was slowly crashing, wasn't it?
Yes. The soil in places like Jamaica was becoming depleted. They were facing fierce competition from beet sugar produced in Europe and cheaper cane sugar from other parts of the world.
So the old mercantilist system, which was heavily protected by tariffs, was dying.
Industrialization was proving that there were more efficient ways to generate wealth than maintaining a slave population.
And here is the detail that completely reframes the narrative: the financial mechanics of the Abolition Act itself.
This is the part that gets left out of the textbooks.
Because the British government didn't pay a single penny in reparations to the hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who'd been tortured, exploited, and robbed of their labor for generations.
Not a penny.
Instead, the government paid £20 million, which was an astronomical sum, a massive percentage of the entire national budget. And they paid it directly to the slave owners.
It was a monumental bailout for the owners of human capital. And the payouts reveal the deep complicity of the entire British establishment.
Oh, tell them about the religious society.
Right, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. This was a deeply respected religious organization. Its ex officio members included the Archbishop of York.
The Archbishop of York?
Yes. They actually owned 2 sugar plantations in Barbados. And when the Abolition Act passed, this religious society pocketed over £8,000 in compensation for the loss of their, quote, property.
So the moral crusade was entirely subsidized by a massive transfer of wealth to the oppressors.
Exactly.
Are we really supposed to believe the empire just suddenly grew a conscience? Or did they just find a cheaper, more efficient business model and dress it up as a divine mission?
The brutal economic truth of the Industrial Revolution was that steam power, combined with a vast pool of desperate so-called free contract labor, was simply more profitable than the high overhead of chattel slavery.
Think about the economics of a plantation. An owner had to feed, house, and provide minimal medical care for an enslaved workforce year-round, regardless of the harvest.
But if you transition to a capitalist labor market, you just pay desperate workers pennies a day. If they get sick or if the harvest is bad, you just fire them.
You bear no responsibility for their survival. You don't have to house them or feed them.
The value of the sugar estates reflected this new reality perfectly. Morris notes a top Jamaican estate that was valued at £11,000 plummeted to just £800 after abolition.
Wow, 11,000 down to 800.
The old system was financially obsolete. Abolition succeeded in 1838 because the genuine moral goals of the humanitarians finally aligned perfectly with the cold mathematics of the new market forces.
Abolition was fundamentally a capitalist upgrade.
A capitalist upgrade. And the result was terrifyingly efficient. To replace the enslaved workers, the empire began shipping hundreds of thousands of indentured laborers from India and even poor workers from Germany to toil in the colonies under grueling contracts.
But because they had legally abolished slavery, the British suddenly possessed this untouchable moral high ground.
And this is where the psychology of the empire begins to shift dangerously. The fusion of evangelical morality and industrial capitalism created a new philosophy: evangelical imperialism.
Right. They began to believe that their economic success was proof of divine favor.
Yes. If they were the sole force for divine morality and human liberty on earth, they suddenly felt they had a blank check to intervene anywhere, in any culture, at any time.
They didn't just want to conquer territory anymore. They genuinely believed they could engineer society for profit.
They thought they could mass-produce civilized human beings on an assembly line, using the exact same principles they used to mass-produce textiles in Manchester.
Which brings us to the fascinating and ultimately tragic social experiment in Sierra Leone.
Ah, yes. Freetown. The British decided to establish a colony on the coast of West Africa. The population consisted of liberated slaves rescued from intercepted slaver ships, alongside former slaves who had fought for the British in the American Revolution.
But they didn't just provide land and leave these people to determine their own futures, did they?
No, the British administrators treated Freetown as a blank canvas for social engineering. They carved the town out of the dense jungle, building it like a neat, geometric Georgian dollhouse.
A dollhouse in the jungle.
They laid out orderly grids. They named the streets after prominent British politicians and reformers: Wilberforce Street, Wellington Street, Gloucester Street.
They constructed this imposing Anglican cathedral. They established Fourah Bay College, an institution designed to provide a classical education.
The explicit goal of the colonial office and the missionary societies was to take these rescued individuals from wildly diverse African backgrounds and forge them into a brand new social class: the Creoles.
They wanted to manufacture black British gentlemen.
Yes, steeped in the Anglican faith, fluent in the rules of the free market, and completely loyal to the crown.
It's the ultimate technological arrogance applied to human beings. They were trying to install a completely new operating system onto foreign hardware.
That's exactly what it was.
They pushed the Creoles to wear heavy European clothing in the sweltering tropics, to play upright pianos in their parlors, to hang portraits of Queen Victoria on their walls.
They wanted them to be a beacon of British civilization that would peacefully radiate into the African interior.
And the most compelling part of this history is that the experiment actually worked. But it worked in a way that completely horrified the moralists who designed it.
It backfired spectacularly. The Creoles proved to be incredibly adept students. They adopted the Creole language, they dressed in starched white collars and heavy, stifling crinolines.
They pursued Victorian respectability with fierce determination.
Right, they learned the lessons of capitalism flawlessly. But instead of becoming humble, peaceful missionaries, quietly spreading the gospel,
They became incredibly wealthy, ruthless entrepreneurs.
they became capitalists in the truest Victorian sense. The paternalistic white clerics at Fourah Bay College were stunned. They watched their star pupils, young men who could fluently recite the moral maxims of William Wilberforce and debate theology, suddenly blossoming into aggressive land speculators and cutthroat businessmen.
Because what does a successful capitalist do? They look for emerging, unregulated markets to exploit.
Exactly.
These freshly minted Creole gentlemen turned around and used their new economic skills, backed by British legal frameworks, to ruthlessly exploit the surrounding, less developed indigenous tribes of the interior.
The situation in Sierra Leone perfectly illustrates the dangerous fallacy of the empire's civilizing mission. Capital's predatory instinct cannot be domesticated by religion.
You cannot teach a group of people the precise mechanics of how to dominate markets, hand them the legal and financial tools of a global empire, and then expect them to act as passive, peaceful servants.
They learned the rules of the game and they played it to win, adopting the exact same exploitative behaviors as their British mentors.
The arrogance of social engineering always backfires, but this unwavering belief that British morals, backed by British guns, simply had to be forced upon the world began to manifest in other, more violent ways.
It did. The Royal Navy, riding high on this evangelical justification, essentially transformed into a rogue global police force.
To understand this shift, we have to look at the West Africa Squadron.
The naval force tasked with patrolling the coastline to intercept illegal slave ships. Following abolition, Britain signed treaties with various nations to suppress the trade.
But the actual day-to-day reality of this moral crusade was an absolute nightmare for the British sailors.
Oh, the assignment was miserable. The West African coast was sweltering, incredibly humid, plagued by malaria and yellow fever. The mortality rate among the crews was staggering.
They were offered a financial incentive, right?
Yes, a bounty of £5 a head for every enslaved person they liberated. But actually, catching the slaver ships was an exercise in pure frustration.
Because of the legal constraints placed on the British captains. They were maddening.
The slaver ships, particularly the sleek, custom-built clippers sailing out of Baltimore, and the fast Spanish and Portuguese schooners, they were incredibly swift. They could often outrun the heavier British frigates.
Furthermore, the human traffickers were absolute masters of exploiting international legal loopholes.
Right. There is a story in the source material about an American slaver, the Martha Ann, that perfectly captures this dynamic.
I love this story. So a British frigate spots her in the middle of the Atlantic and gives chase. The American ship doesn't even bother to raise a flag to identify herself.
The British actually have to fire warning shots across her bow just to get her to stop.
And when the heavily armed British officers finally row over, board the ship, and angrily demand to know why the captain refused to identify his vessel, the American captain just leans back and languidly replies, "I guess we were eating our supper."
Just unbelievable contempt, and entirely legal. Because the United States had not signed certain mutual search treaties with Britain, the Royal Navy was legally hamstrung.
Even if a British captain boarded a foreign vessel and found it packed with shackles, chains, and massive water barrels clearly designed for human cargo, they often couldn't seize the ship unless there were enslaved people physically on board at that exact moment.
The traffickers would simply laugh at the British officers and sail away.
So you have the most powerful military force on Earth, a navy that defeated Napoleon, being illegally trolled and humiliated by international human traffickers.
The tension builds and builds until finally the empire just snaps. The moment the mask of legal order falls away happens in 1840 at a place called the Gallinas River.
Commander Joseph Denman.
Commander Denman, he was patrolling the coast in his armed schooner, the Wanderer. The Gallinas estuary was an infamous, highly lucrative slave mart. It was a massive operation run by a Spanish trader named Pedro Blanco, who operated in deep alliance with a powerful local African ruler, King Siaka.
Crucially, this is an independent sovereign territory. The British Empire had absolutely no legal jurisdiction there.
None. But Commander Denman reaches his breaking point. A black British subject from Sierra Leone, a woman named Mrs. Fry Norman, is kidnapped by King Siaka's son over an unpaid debt and held in the estuary.
Denman uses this single incident as his casus belli. He doesn't consult lawyers in London. He doesn't wait for an act of parliament.
He takes his armed schooner, loads up his boats with heavily armed bluejackets, storms the swamps, and launches a full-scale military invasion.
Denman's forces burn the entire operation to the ground. They destroyed the barracoons, those brutal makeshift wooden and thatched prisons where enslaved people were caged before enduring the Middle Passage.
He liberated over 1,000 captives, and then he forced the local African chiefs at gunpoint to sign a treaty permanently abandoning the slave trade.
When you look at the raw mechanics of this event, the moral police of the world basically threw international law out the window and became vigilantes.
Vigilantes. They unilaterally decided, we are the law because our morals are superior and we have the biggest guns. Sovereign borders do not apply to us.
And the British legal establishment entirely supported him. When one of the Spanish slave traders later had the audacity to sue Denman in a British court for trespass and destruction of property, the judges essentially directed the jury to clear him.
Denman's defense rested on a concept that would define the entire era. Civis Britannicus sum. I am a British citizen.
I am a British citizen, therefore I carry the ultimate moral authority, and any action I take to enforce my worldview is inherently justified.
It established a chilling precedent. Gunboat diplomacy was no longer just an economic tool, it was a moral imperative. If international law or foreign sovereignty frustrated their goals, the empire felt entirely justified in rewriting the law with cannons.
The danger of assuming you possess absolute moral superiority is that it removes all limits on the violence you are willing to employ.
Exactly.
So what happens when this unstoppable, heavily armed machine of civilized order collides with a group of people who want absolutely nothing to do with it?
A collision of operating systems.
Right. A people who don't want your infrastructure, your morality, or your global markets, and just want to be left entirely alone. That collision takes us to South Africa and the story of the Boers.
The conflict between the British Empire and the Boers, the Afrikaners of Dutch, French, and German descent, is one of the most revealing clashes of the 19th century.
The Boers had lived in the Cape Colony for generations, and their entire societal philosophy was centered around a concept they called the lekker loo, or the sweet life.
And their definition of the sweet life is fascinating because it is the exact opposite of Victorian London.
They wanted absolute, untethered, fiercely independent freedom. They relied almost entirely on the Old Testament for their worldview.
They wanted pastoral farms so incredibly massive that you couldn't even see the smoke from your closest neighbor's chimney.
They despised bureaucracy. They hated the idea of paying taxes, and they didn't want a centralized government interfering in their daily lives.
However, that freedom was predicated on a very dark foundation. The Boers firmly believed in a rigid, divinely ordained racial hierarchy where they were the masters and the indigenous African populations were destined to serve them. Their social structure relied heavily on the forced labor of local tribes.
Then the British Empire arrives in the Cape, bringing the full weight of their administrative bureaucracy and their new evangelical imperialism.
The British start mapping the territory, collecting taxes, and imposing modern, centralized laws. In 1828, the British pass an ordinance declaring black and white people equal before the law. In 1833, they officially abolish slavery throughout the empire.
To the British, they were bringing civilization and humanitarian progress to a backward frontier.
But to the Boers, this was an apocalyptic destruction of their entire way of life. The British laws didn't just threaten their economy, they threatened what the Boers believed was a divine order. The interference of the British magistrates and missionaries was intolerable.
So the Boers made an incredible decision. In 1837, they decide to completely opt out of the 19th century.
Over 10,000 Boers pack their families and their entire lives into massive, heavy ox wagons. They gather their vast herds of cattle and they simply walk away.
They turn their backs on the British Cape Colony and trek into the brutal, largely unmapped interior of the African continent.
This mass migration is known as the Great Trek. It was an arduous, incredibly dangerous journey. They crossed the Orange River, they hauled their heavy wagons over the treacherous Drakensberg Mountains.
They were seeking a promised land, a new Israel in the wilderness, where they could escape the suffocating humanitarianism and bureaucracy of the British Empire.
They genuinely believed they could outrun global capital.
They moved deep into the territory, fighting fierce, bloody battles with the Zulu nation along the way, like the Battle of Blood River in 1838, and eventually established their own independent state on the eastern coast, the Republic of Natal.
For a brief moment, they thought they had succeeded. They set up a rustic capital in Pietermaritzburg, rolled out simple dirt streets, built a church, and thought they were finally free to live the sweet life.
But the tragedy of the Boers was their failure to understand the nature of the machine they were running from.
The empire's capital expands far faster than ox wagons can roll.
The British realized that the port of Durban, located within the new Boer Republic, was strategically valuable. More importantly, the British Colonial Office simply could not tolerate a power vacuum.
They couldn't allow a group of renegade former subjects to set up an independent, unregulated state right on their borders. It could cause conflicts with massive indigenous empires like the Zulus, which would disrupt regional trade and stability.
So the empire's response was swift and methodical. In 1842, the British essentially audit the Boers' escape attempt.
They send the redcoats.
A British frigate, the Southampton, sails casually into Durban Bay. Heavily armed troops disembark with their artillery pieces and their regimental bands playing, and they simply swallow the Boers whole all over again.
The independent Republic of Natal is annexed and folded back into the matrix of the empire.
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario for anyone trying to go off the grid.
Imagine moving to a hidden cabin in the deep woods, digging your own well, generating your own power, and thinking you have finally escaped society.
And a year later, the government shows up in a helicopter to audit your solar panels and hand you a property tax bill. You literally cannot outrun a global monopoly.
The psychological terror the Boers experienced in that moment was profound. They realized that British civilization, with its laws, its markets, and its inescapable reach, was omnipotent.
It bred a deep generational resentment, a simmering hatred among the Afrikaners that would eventually explode into one of the most brutal wars of the century.
This inescapable power, this obsessive need to control, categorize, and dominate every corner of the globe. It wasn't just fueled by military strength or economic greed.
According to the historical record, it was fueled by a terrifying new religion, the absolute worship of technology. Let's fast forward a few years to 1851.
The Great Exhibition of 1851 in London marks a massive psychological pivot. This is the exact moment in history when machines stop being viewed merely as useful tools for industry and become objects of profound, almost spiritual veneration.
The centerpiece of this exhibition was an architectural marvel known as the Crystal Palace.
19 acres of iron and glass.
Designed by the brilliant gardener and architect Joseph Paxton, erected right in the middle of Hyde Park. It was so massive it enclosed fully grown elm trees inside its glass walls.
And inside this glittering structure, the British gathered the absolute peak of their global technological monopoly.
The exhibition contained thousands of artifacts from across the empire, everything from exotic textiles to a preserved pig from Dublin. But the undisputed stars of the show were the machines.
Massive steam engines, incredibly complex mechanical looms, telegraph equipment, precision iron machine tools. Millions of people, from common laborers to foreign dignitaries, walked through the glass halls.
But they didn't just admire these inventions the way we might admire a new smartphone today. They worshipped them.
Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, who was the driving visionary behind the exhibition, didn't just think a steam engine was an efficient way to pump water out of a coal mine. He and the Victorian elite truly believed that technology, driven by British genius, was going to cure human evil.
It became a secular religion. The poets and philosophers of the era genuinely believed that science, industry, and interconnected commerce were ushering mankind into a permanent golden age of peace.
There is a fascinating anecdote from the era that captures this reverence perfectly. A passing government steam train was observed by a crowd, and as it rushed by, the engineer actually doffed his hat, the firemen bowed, and the passengers looked down from the carriages as if they had achieved a higher, almost divine state of existence simply by riding the machine.
The idea that better infrastructure would literally save human souls seems incredibly naive in hindsight.
Very naive.
Did they honestly believe a faster mechanical loom or a telegraph wire would suddenly cure human greed, jealousy, and violence? Because if we look at our own modern era, we've learned the hard way that technology doesn't change fundamental human nature. It just scales up our flaws.
Exactly. Give a greedy man a telegraph, and he just commits financial fraud at the speed of light.
That historical blindness is the tragedy of their hubris. But if we connect this technological worship back to the mechanics of the empire, it gave the British a terrifying sense of infallibility.
If you truly believe that your steamships, your repeating rifles, and your telegraph networks are the literal instruments of God's grace and human progress, then anyone who stands in your way isn't just a geopolitical rival. They are an enemy of enlightenment itself.
It provides the ultimate justification for any atrocity. If we are bringing the railway, we are bringing salvation. Therefore, it doesn't matter how many indigenous villages we have to burn down or how many cultures we have to pave over to lay the tracks.
The technology validates the violence. The profits from the Great Exhibition were so massive they were used to purchase land in South Kensington to build vast museums of science and art, institutionalizing this belief system in the heart of London.
But this supreme confidence creates a fragile national psychology. What happens when you build your entire identity on being the sole, uncontested masters of the machine, and then you look over your shoulder and realize the rest of the world is catching up?
And that is exactly what happens as we move into the 1870s and 1880s. The golden, confident age of the Crystal Palace begins to crack.
The rest of the world has spent decades reverse engineering the British operating system, and the invincible global champion starts to panic.
The strategic and economic landscape shifts dramatically. Following the devastation of their civil war, the United States emerges as a ravenous, continent-spanning industrial titan. Meanwhile, a newly unified Germany is rapidly building more steel capacity and fielding the most formidable modern land army in Europe.
The old magic trick of free trade completely stops working. These new industrial competitors aren't playing by the British rules.
They are throwing up massive protective tariffs to shelter their own growing industries while simultaneously flooding the open British markets with cheaper goods.
The British Empire is suddenly no longer secure, and the nature of the empire degrades rapidly in response.
It shifts from being a confident, supposedly moral duty led by the humanitarians in Exeter Hall to a desperate, vulgar, purely defensive grab for territory. This is the era of the scramble for Africa.
The civilizing mission devolves into a brutal geopolitical chess match. The British start claiming vast tracts of the African continent, not because they even have a clear economic plan for them, but simply to prevent the French or the Germans from getting there first.
It is paranoid, defensive expansionism, and the domestic reaction to this desperation is deeply revealing.
Instead of questioning the imperial project, the British public embraces an aggressive, jingoistic nationalism.
Imperialism transforms into a frantic, lowbrow spectator sport. The subtle, aristocratic confidence of the early Victorian era is replaced by a loud, chest-thumping chauvinism.
The public starts collecting cheap biscuit tins stamped with imperial logos. They pack into music halls to sing incredibly aggressive, racist songs about blowing up foreigners with the Royal Navy.
The whole concept of empire becomes cheapened, a distraction from the economic anxieties at home. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a master of political theater, recognizes this psychological shift and brilliantly capitalizes on it.
In 1876, he orchestrates a massive legislative PR stunt, passing the Royal Titles Act to officially crown Queen Victoria as the Empress of India.
It's all glittering branding. It's a shiny illusion designed to hide their strategic panic.
And again, this feels incredibly relevant today. When a global superpower starts losing its actual manufacturing base, when it feels economic competitors breathing down its neck, the government almost inevitably turns to extreme nationalism, flag-waving, and flashy global PR stunts to distract the public from the rot underneath.
It is a classic, almost diagnostic symptom of late-stage imperial decline. As Morris astutely notes, the idea of empire was becoming vulgarized. It was a nouveau riche imperialism.
The philosophical and moral justifications were being stripped away, leaving only raw greed, strategic fear, and a desperate, frantic need to maintain the appearance of absolute power.
And this toxic combination of greed and desperation leads directly to the most shocking loss of sanity in the empire's history.
We have to talk about the Jameson Raid of 1895. This is the moment where the empire completely loses its mind and the moral mask finally slips off for the entire world to see.
We are back in South Africa. Remember the stubborn Boers who trekked out into the wilderness to escape the British?
Right. They established the Transvaal Republic, a dusty agricultural state.
Mm-hmm.
But then they suddenly discovered they are sitting on the Witwatersrand, the most massive, lucrative supply of gold in the history of the world.
The geopolitical stakes of this gold discovery cannot be overstated. The British Empire, now feeling intense economic pressure from America and Germany, absolutely needs to control that gold to maintain the stability of the pound sterling and back its global financial hegemony.
But Paul Kruger, the deeply conservative president of the Transvaal, absolutely refuses to submit to British control.
Kruger knows exactly what the British want. Thousands of foreign miners, mostly British, known as the Uitlanders, have flooded into Johannesburg to dig up the gold. Kruger heavily taxes the dynamite they need for mining, and he refuses to give them voting rights, terrified they will simply vote the Transvaal into the British Empire.
Sitting in Cape Town watching this stalemate is Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes is the premier of the Cape Colony, a massive diamond and gold mining magnate, and a man driven by a megalomaniacal vision of British dominance.
He realizes that legal and diplomatic pressure on Kruger isn't working, so Rhodes and his right-hand man, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, conspire to execute a secret, highly illegal invasion.
They don't consult Parliament. They don't declare war. They orchestrate a massive corporate heist.
They gather a private mercenary army of about 470 men, arm them with the latest Maxim machine guns, and stage them at the border in a place called Pitsani.
The plot was incredibly convoluted. The plan was to secretly smuggle weapons to the British miners inside Johannesburg, incite a fake armed uprising against Kruger's government, and then Jameson would ride his mercenary column across the border under the pretext of rescuing the endangered British citizens.
It was an imperial smash and grab masquerading as a humanitarian intervention.
But the execution of the plan is an absolute catastrophe. The British miners in Johannesburg get cold feet. The uprising fizzles out before it even begins.
Rhodes realizes the plan is falling apart and tries to send frantic telegrams calling off the invasion. But Jameson, drunk on imperial hubris, ignores the warnings, cuts the telegraph wires, and rides his column across the border on December 29, 1895.
The Boer militias, who are fiercely independent and exceptional marksmen, know exactly what is happening. They simply track Jameson's column, surround them at a place called Doornkop, and systematically crush them.
Jameson and his mercenaries are forced to surrender in days. It is a humiliating, incredibly public military blunder.
The international fallout is immediate. The Kaiser of Germany, reveling in Britain's embarrassment, actually sends a telegram to President Kruger congratulating him on smashing the invaders without appealing to friendly powers.
The British government is absolutely enraged by German interference, but the raid itself was undeniably a criminal act.
Now, rationally, one would expect the British public to be deeply appalled. This was an unprovoked, illegal armed incursion into a sovereign state by a band of corporate mercenaries attempting to steal a gold supply.
It violated every single principle of international law and the supposed moral high ground the British Empire had preached for 60 years.
But this is where the history becomes terrifying. The British public doesn't condemn them. They cheer for the criminals, they applaud the raid.
When Dr. Jameson is brought back to London to face trial, he is treated like a conquering national hero. Crowds mob the streets to cheer for him. Society ladies write poems praising his bravery.
This reaction perfectly illustrates what happens to a society's collective psychology when it realizes its prosperity relies entirely on dominance, and it feels that dominance slipping.
Morality is dead. The rule of law becomes irrelevant. The public didn't care that the raid was an illegal corporate crime. They only cared that it was an aggressive attempt to assert British power against an insolent rival.
I am continually shocked by this moment. They completely dropped the "we are civilizing the world" narrative. It became nothing but a smash-and-grab robbery for gold, and the citizens loved them for it.
It is the equivalent of a society rooting for heavily armed bank robbers purely because the robbers are wearing the home team's jersey.
Winston Churchill, reflecting on this event years later, explicitly dated the beginning of the violent times and the ultimate collapse of the imperial order to the Jameson raid.
It destroyed the moral credibility of the empire on the world stage forever. The hypocrisy was undeniable. Yet, ironically, this absolute moral bankruptcy leads us directly to the ultimate, glittering, deafening climax of the era.
Which brings us to the end of the narrative arc. 1897, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The empire decides to throw its loudest, most expensive, most visually overwhelming party.
By this point, the British literally rule 1/4 of the Earth's landmass and dictate the lives of 1/3 of the global population.
The Jubilee was designed as the ultimate flex of absolute unassailable power. The streets of London were packed with millions of spectators. A staggering parade of troops from every conceivable corner of the globe marched past. African riflemen, Indian lancers in glittering turbans, Canadian Mounties, Australian cavalry.
At the center of it all is the 78-year-old Queen Victoria, wearing a dress of black moire embroidered with silver roses. She goes to a special telegraph room, presses an electric button, and a message shoots across the globe in a matter of seconds.
From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them. The message hits Ottawa, Calcutta, the Cape Colony simultaneously. It is the absolute, blinding zenith of the Victorian operating system. Looking at the parade, they appear immortal.
But Jan Morris's autopsy reveals the fatal reality. The foundation beneath the glittering pageantry was entirely rotten. The entire Jubilee was a magnificent illusion masking deep structural decay.
The numbers didn't add up anymore. The sheer cost of maintaining the military garrisons and the naval fleets required to hold this massive territory was bankrupting the treasury.
The population of Britain had exploded, and they were now completely reliant on massive foreign food imports just to keep their citizens from starving. If the shipping lanes were ever cut, the home islands would fall in weeks.
And those foreign competitors, the Americans and the Germans, weren't just looming on the horizon. They were actively dismantling British economic supremacy, outproducing them in steel, chemicals, and modern manufacturing.
There's a chilling detail from the crowds that day. Among the millions of people cheering wildly in London was the American writer Mark Twain.
He stood there, watching this unimaginable display of wealth, technological might, and military power marching past. But with the sharp, cynical eye of an outsider who understood the rising power of America, he didn't call it a triumph.
He watched the parade and called it a suggestion of the last day.
A rehearsal for Judgment Day.
Yeah.
The British ruling class believed they had coded the ultimate operating system for global dominance. They genuinely thought their free trade, their steam engines, and their self-proclaimed moral superiority made them immune to the cyclical laws of history.
But their incredible prosperity bred arrogance, and that arrogance bred a paranoia and a madness that completely blinded them to their own decay.
It is a profoundly sobering realization. The deep mechanics of hegemony we've discussed, the use of economic coercion disguised as free trade, the weaponization of moral justifications to launch military interventions, the desperate turn toward nationalism and PR stunts when actual economic dominance begins to fade. These are not dusty relics of the 19th century.
They are the recurring, inescapable patterns of global power, and that leaves us with a critical, uncomfortable question. When that diagnostic X-ray machine of history is turned on our own era, what do the bones look like? Because as we've seen, the structural fractures in a global system are always present long before the ultimate break occurs.
I want you to take a hard look at our world today. Look at the massive tech monopolies that control our global communications and commerce, dictating terms to sovereign nations. Look at the supply chains that wrap around the planet, built on the cheapest possible labor. Look at the constant, sophisticated PR battles fought by superpowers claiming moral supremacy while simultaneously extracting vast resources. Are we worshiping the algorithm with the exact same blind faith they use to worship the steam engine? Are we standing on our own precipice, chewing wildly at our own high-tech Diamond Jubilee, completely blind to the crash that comes next? Take a deep dive into that thought. The echoes of the 19th century are ringing louder than ever. Thanks for joining us.